friends, I'm Cleo Roseborough, and for our Unit 5 reading from The Psychology of Motion and Restorative Practice, How Affect Script Psychology Explains How and Why Restorative Practice Works, edited by Vernon C. Kelly Jr. and Margaret Thursborn. The additional chapter that I read was Chapter 8, which was titled Drama Queens by Margaret Thursborn. Something important mentioned by Thursborn at the beginning of the chapter is that she had initially done this work with Sharon Burrows, who passed away, and she wants to make sure to acknowledge and honor her work and thank her. So here we go. There are some key figures in these interviews. There's Annie, Colleen, and Frances as sort of our big three, the main people that we focus on during this reading. Annie is one of the drama teachers who got her degree in education and majored in drama, and she started at the school 1 year before Colleen did. Colleen is also a drama teacher, but she comes from a performer background, and she's new to the school. And then Frances is the head of faculty who is very conflict averse. She's trusted by her faculty to be nice, but is not considered an active problem solver. Other figures mentioned in the story are Jack, the principal, Jenny, who acts as a support for Annie later in the conference, and Maria, who acts as a support later for Colleen during conferences. Finally, we have Ben, Sally, Sam, Val, who are our other colleagues who give brief interviews on how they've been affected by the multi-year conflict between Annie and Colleen. So I'm going to be leaning on a couple of visual resources for this presentation. I'll be leaning on the visuals of the competitiveness, jealousy, shame triangle, the shame compass, and the relationship window. All of these graphics can be found in Kelly's text, and the specific relationship window graphic can also be found in a number of our previous readings. I'm going to do some jumping around of which graphic I use on each slide because it best reflects how my brain was processing the text. But if that makes this too convoluted or distracting, I would really appreciate that feedback for future presentations so that I can make them more accessible. So I'm going to be leaning on a couple of the foundation of the conflict between Annie and Colleen comes from training issues and the lack of relationship between the two of them. In regards to Colleen's onboarding, Annie was ill-equipped to be able to provide her with proper training because Annie had not been given a lot of training and support when she first came on. And so since Annie kind of learned by flying the plane while building it, that's how she expected Colleen to learn too. She was just practicing what had been modeled for her, and unfortunately what had been modeled for her was not a sufficient amount of support. However, because of Colleen's different professional experiences and the new hopes and expectations she had entering teaching, she felt disappointed and felt abandoned because of the lack of support. Annie and Colleen, again, come from different professional backgrounds, which is not an issue, except for the fact that expectations between the two of them on how a class and how a performance should be run were extremely different. Annie became frustrated with Colleen for raising expectations for students and changing assignments without communicating with her, meaning that not only were expectations being set that were considered to be too high by many of the voices in this story, especially Annie, but that Annie and Colleen didn't have an opportunity to work together to provide support to be able to reach new expectations. Colleen's expertise as a performer could have accompanied Annie's expertise as a teacher with scaffolding and realistic performance standards for children well, and it's unfortunate that the two didn't get a chance to help the students explore the bounds of their creativity in a more healthy, structured way. Annie felt criticized because of Colleen's changing of her work, and she felt unsteady, and Colleen felt like her efforts and experiences were now being discounted. Colleen felt that Annie was withdrawing, and Annie was beginning to make passive-aggressive comments towards Colleen. Colleen felt like this reflected competitiveness from Annie, which Thursborn identified as an attack on others from Colleen's part. I wondered more about the connection to avoidance, and the work that Colleen was trying to do was being interpreted as showing up Annie. This was particularly difficult for Colleen because she noticed that Annie was collaborating with another colleague, Jenny, who was also Annie's roommate and will show up again later. And Colleen felt like the pair behaved in ways that rejected Colleen's attempts to find a place in the school community, so making different looks when she came by, conversations ending if she came in the room. And so it resulted in Colleen feeling isolated and starting to turn that shame inward and doubt her capabilities as a teacher. So where we hit a snag immediately is that Colleen does not then go to Frances about this. She hasn't seen how professional feedback has been given in a dignified, positive way in this environment, so she has no clear idea about what the expectations of collaboration are, as well as with the consequences of conflict and what support she should or should not be expecting. And again, that shame was being turned inward for Colleen. Frances's reputation of being conflict averse did not help. Colleen neither received necessary training nor necessary invitation into the community with a bridge to do so because of this lack of training. She didn't have a trusting relationship with Frances, and so therefore why would she come to her, especially if she's starting to attack herself with shame too. So the next school year rolls around, and Annie in the relationship window model jumps to a 2, assigning classes to Colleen and herself, but without consulting Colleen. Again, she and Colleen do not have a trusting relationship, do not have a professional relationship, and so rather than it being a discussion, especially one considering Colleen's needs as a new teacher, Annie has made this decision on her own based off of her individual needs and desires and not considering how it will ripple out into the community. This was observed by other faculty as well, and the conflict repeated itself with each schedule change during the year. So Colleen felt like Annie was being entitled by not evenly sharing the workload of classes that took a little more lift. Annie felt like Colleen was being entitled because she had not put in the same amount of time that Annie had put into building a strong program. And again, Frances does not seem to be present to provide guidance on how to make decisions that honor the needs of the students, Annie or Colleen. Something I thought was interesting that Thursborn does in order to maintain the structural integrity of people's different interview is the story is told a little bit out of order. So we're going to jump into the largest eruption in the conflict between Annie and Colleen over the 3 years, and then I'll stick it back into the timeline for more understanding later. So what seemed to be the most intense conflict between Colleen and Annie was when Colleen was distressed and yelled at students and attacked Annie to such a degree that students then decided to verbally attacked Annie to such a degree where then students decided to check on Annie, which kids taking care of us is never a good sign in adult conflict resolution, in my opinion. This was over a performance and the quality of performance that the kids were delivering. Students reported not only was Colleen yelling, but she was using abusive and profane language, all of which then Annie reported to Frances. Frances at this point decides she's going to jump in from the not window in the relationship window into the to window and publicly reprimands Colleen, which prompts further distress and rage in Colleen. So at this point, Annie, Colleen, and their various colleagues have all experienced a plethora of negative affects and have bounced all around the shame compass. So now that we're going to talk about the first facilitated conference involving administration and eventually the workplace conference circle, I'm going to share a little bit more about some of the other key figures to the story. So Jenny is Annie's roommate and is a colleague of Annie and Colleen. And she's attempted before to facilitate discussions between Colleen and Annie, but she felt that Colleen's attack others impulse on that shame compass made it too painful for her to try to engage, and it resulted in her withdrawing from a relationship with Colleen. Maria felt unhappy about how she viewed Annie and Jenny's treatment of Colleen, and her interest and distress manifested in her becoming very protective of Colleen and feeling as though it was her job to nurture her through this conflict. Sam was a colleague who felt embarrassed when Colleen would lash out and felt like the conflict was unresolvable. Ben was also new, who was experiencing the emotional resonance of Colleen and Annie echoing through the room, and so immediately turned into attack himself, and then felt uncomfortable that this conflict seemed to be one that no one was addressing directly. Val was a coworker who expressed feeling like she, quote, wanted the ground to open up for her and for her to disappear when she reflected on the situation. And finally, Jack is the principal who led the first attempt at mediation between Annie and Colleen and has built a strong relationship and deep trust with other members of the faculty. While he was skilled and able to mediate conflicts between individuals, he'd later discover that he needs some support in repairing echoes of conflict that impact the rest of the school community. So Jack starts out trying to start the conference in the with window. Jenny came to act as a support for Annie. Maria was there to support Colleen, and Frances was present as the head of faculty. Jack gave Colleen and Annie 4 questions to be prepared to answer in the circle and gave Jenny and Maria the instructions that they could be there to physically support Colleen and Annie, but they weren't supposed to speak. Colleen interpreted the directions differently than Annie had, so it resulted in Annie on question 1 being on a completely different page from Colleen, and sort of listing what she felt like Colleen's transgressions were, and Colleen feeling surprised and humiliated and attacked. Thorsborn said that the misunderstanding of the directions or the difference in the interpretation of the directions between Annie and Colleen was immediately assigned that the circle was, quote, doomed, which I agree with, because already someone who may have prepped themselves to enter with an interest affect, with a positive affect, now gets shifted into surprise at best and shame or humiliation more on the negative affect side, feeling unprepared to share, be heard, receive, and being in a place where then you are rejecting vulnerability and spinning on the shame compass because there's no trust in the community you are being asked to be vulnerable in, and so it has the potential to be deeply humiliating and create further conflict. Maria broke the rule of an observer and questioned Annie and Colleen's ability to simply set their feelings aside and get along professionally, which shut Annie down to the point where she and Jenny left. Frances, at this point, does engage in a with fashion and convinces them to come back, where Maria apologizes, but at this point, Colleen had become overwhelmed after trying to defend herself against Annie's claims and the disruption of Annie and Jennifer leaving, and Jenny leaving. I have a cousin named Jennifer. And so then she and Maria at this point also withdraw from the circle, and they do not return. Afterwards, Frances tries to work with Annie and Colleen to find some sort of resolution, and they develop a contract for professional behavior. which worked until the peak conflict occurred, which was Colleen yelling at Annie and the students. I do not know what the expectations for professional behavior were set, what expectations were set, nor do I know what the consequence or follow-up for not adhering to those agreements was supposed to be. But this all results in Jack calling in support from Thorsborn and Boros to host a workplace conference circle. So first, the faculty workplace conference found a way to manage stressors that might have inhibited people's ability to engage with the conference. So they did things like making sure that there was food, finding subs for the teachers, everyone was invited, and they encouraged people to do any necessary aftercare, including not coming in the next day to be able to emotionally recover. And while maintaining the circle structure, everyone who came to the meeting was instructed to sit on the side they had chosen in the conflict. They then set ground rules for communication and goals, hoping to maximize the positive affect, minimize negative affect, and prevent the inhibition of minimizing those negative and positive affects. So being able to lean into that vulnerability, but trust that the positive affect is coming eventually. I paraphrased the ground rules and copied the goals directly from the book. And so if you want to read it yourself, they're on pages 190 and 191. You can take a minute to just read that. But people began the conference displaying discomfort and hesitance to share. Something important to mention is that this had become a point of concern for many members of the faculty because the drama that the drama department was becoming known for was damaging the reputation of the school. So during her testimony, Colleen was visibly angry and attacked people through sarcasm. And after some self-reflection and some conversations with Thorsborn, she was able to regulate and reset. I appreciated the sharing of this moment with Colleen because it reflected that even though at the start, Annie and Colleen felt as though there was no point in even building a relationship, no point in resolving this conflict, that even when put on the spot in front of her colleagues, Colleen did then not withdraw again. There's a quote that Thorsborn uses from Vernon C. Kelly Jr. about the importance of shame reduction by shame induction. So being able to talk about something can make us feel better. So after Colleen had settled, that emotional resonance was felt again, and it enabled everyone else to also feel more comfortable and connect. So the group came up with some strategies to answer that query: what needs to happen now to improve things for the faculty? Again, I copied here the strategies recorded by Thorsborn directly from the text. It's on page 195. I'm going to condense them in the next slides. All of them were developed to follow that central blueprint for maximizing positive affect, minimizing negative affect, and minimizing the inhibition of affects, and maximizing the power to do all three. The group felt like they had reached the beginning goals of the conference, and later check-ins would confirm that the faculty did feel a settle and shift in the culture. Aftercare follow-up work was done with Colleen, Annie, and Frances after being flooded with feelings of shame and distress from confronting the conflict and hearing from their colleagues, and they understandably needed more time to feel recovered from the conference. In the end, Colleen needed to leave the school to tend to a sick family member, so we don't get to see what happened between Annie and Colleen, what developed, but as I said, we do have access to the feedback from the rest of the faculty about the improvement in school culture. My condensed version of the strategies that the faculty came up with are that people need to communicate with clarity, strategy, and interest, especially at the point of vulnerability, so issues don't fester and leak out into the general community. People need to practice respectful and professional self-regulation. If we wouldn't let the kids do it, we can't do it either. And people need to continue the circle work and working together. I really appreciated reading these interviews, but was left with some lingering questions. My number one question was what repair work was done with the students who were yelled at and cursed at. I want to know what happened with them. There was a lot of work done to repair Annie and Colleen's places in the community, to restore their places in the community, and I'm wondering what was done to repair relationships between Colleen and her students, or potentially reestablish some emotional boundaries between Annie and her students. I'm wondering about how the reputation of the school changed, as that was something that other faculty members had expressed concern about. I'm curious as to what Colleen and Annie would say now, reflecting on this situation, now that there's been some distance, and I'm curious about how the leadership styles of Frances and Jack changed after this experience.